Welcome to this episode of the Skip Meetings podcast, the podcast for curious professionals embracing the future of business events. My name is Miguel Neves. I'm the editor-in-chief of Skip Meetings, and in this episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with Vanessa Lovatt, the founder of Forte Futures. This episode is titled Customer Obsessed Leadership. In our conversation, we talk about how we can take full advantage of the potential of virtual events. We talk about why taking a less is more approach to technology is almost always the right thing to do. We talk about how service level is the game changer for event technology providers. We talk about the rise of bleisure and how planners can use it to their advantage. And we talk about how there are more women in leadership positions today, but there is still lots of work to do. I hope you enjoy listening to this conversation, and I invite you to check out the other episodes of the podcast. You can find them on our website or by subscribing through your favorite podcast service. So welcome, everybody. This is another episode of the Skip Meetings podcast, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Vanessa Lovatt. Vanessa, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It is absolutely brilliant to have the chance to do this with you.
So always good to chat. Wanted to start by just asking you to give a short introduction about your experience in events, your career so far. Would love to start from the point of where you kind of first come across the industry and in some ways, I don't know if I'm putting words in your mouth, but sort of understand that there is an events industry, because I think a lot of people don't necessarily know that when they're growing up and when they're kind of, figuring out their career, and then talk about where you are now.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting you say a lot of people don't know necessarily about the events industry as they're coming up through their career. I think there's a lot of very, very experienced business professionals who still have no idea what the scope and scale of this amazing industry is. So I got into events quite early on. I was 21, I think, actually, when I joined the first conferencing company that I got involved with. And it was, as it is for so many people in this world, a little bit of an unexpected but very pleasant accident. I was working for some fashion retail brands, which was what I thought I wanted to do. And it turns out I really didn't get the connection with it that I thought I was going to. And a friend of a friend worked at the incredibly impressive organization that is Informa. In fact, she still works there, so this is quite some time ago, and she's incredibly senior there now on their operations team. And she introduced me to the concept of commercial conferencing in a nutshell. And I learned all about this amazing event that they were going to run. It was when Informa was still responsible for the GSMA events. So this is quite a long time ago now. And they were desperately in need of team members to go out to Cannes a couple of weeks later and help them run the event. So instantly, as a 21-year-old, I was like, ooh, I can go to France in 2 weeks and help run an event. And as it turned out, I wasn't able to go, but that was how I found out about the event sector. And very quickly then did my research, found out about another couple of companies, ended up interviewing with 3 different companies for a variety of roles. One was in operations, one was in sales, and one was in production, which in conferencing companies doesn't mean the audio-visual production side of the event. It means actually writing the programs and doing the background research. And that was the role I ended up in as my first events role, and then stayed with that company. It was a commercial conferencing company. So all of my background is B2B. That's probably a really important thing for me to share early on, that my contexts and learnings and experiences have all been in the B2B events world. Very heavily in commercial conferencing, also internal communications events, marketing events, a lot of go-to-market and lead generation and brand building events too. And it's been amazing. I mean, it's just been a whirlwind of experiences. I've been very lucky to not just work in real life events, in-person events, as we often now call them. We never used to have a name for them, did we? But in 2012, so quite a long time ago now, I ran my first ever digital event, which at the time it was so basic. I mean, I cringe when I think about how basic it was now from a technical setup, but it worked and it was quite innovative at the time. And I spent a lot of time then working on digital only events, which pre-pandemic made me something of an oddity actually in the sector. There weren't a lot of people doing that way
Can
back
I just ask, that's a really interesting kind of part of the journey, but can I just ask, what was the motivation for doing virtual events from the company or from the organization?
I so this makes me chuckle as well, actually. The team that I was working with at the time, absolutely phenomenal team of hungry and willing to take risks individuals, calculated, measured risks, of course, but experimental, that's the word I'm looking for. They were very, very experimental group. And at the time we were running a lot of sponsored webinars. So a sponsor would invest in running a webinar. We would effectively run it for them, make sure that the content was incentivizing for their target audience to want to register and ultimately sign up. And we used to sit around and have these conversations. What's the next webinar? What's the next webinar? We used to ask ourselves this all the time. We'd say webinars are getting old. And that we were so wrong. They really weren't, as it turned out. But because we were running so many of them, at the time they felt like they were perhaps getting a bit stale, and we were looking for a new solution to offer to sponsors, but also something a little grander, I guess, than a webinar and a standalone session. We wanted to be able to offer a more wholesome, I guess, or holistic experience online. And we did this through a combination of very, very basic series linked webinars, but we did also start to look at use the virtual event platforms that did exist then, which there weren't very many, which I realize sounds crazy now because there are so many, but I think there were maybe 6, and they were pretty basic. Some of them were actually relatively advanced. But
what are we talking about here? Inexpo, Digitel, 6 Connects, maybe? I don't know.
Yes, and then the one that we did end up using quite a bit, which would have been a little bit later on, maybe 2017, I'm going to guess onwards, was VFairs. Used VFairs quite a bit actually as an early user. Great team to work with. I mean, so responsive, so helpful, which we really needed because it was still a pretty new concept back then, and that was very heavily designed. You had the auditorium that you'd visually walk into, and then trying to get delegates to behave how we wanted them to behave was really hard, really, really hard. But we developed a few tips and tricks.
Interesting. And where did you go from there then?
Yes, so when I left there, I set up independently. I think I was with that company for 14 wonderful years, but 14 years is a really long time to be in the same place. And I very much needed to not be in the same place, I think, for a little while after that. So I worked with quite a few, 5 in total, different, I would call them B2B media businesses, because they weren't all just events businesses actually, to help set up or expand their digital presence, which was all around webinars, digital events, or digital content. Actually, it could have been written or video content as well. And that's what I was doing when the pandemic hit. So I had 5 brilliant customers, all of whom were already investing in their digital expansion, which was great, but they all wanted more time. And they all wanted and needed more, which was completely right. And it was I was a fortunate person, I guess, in that regard, that I was winning more business, not less business. And I remember on multiple occasions feeling really quite guilty that so many of my amazing previous colleagues and contacts in the industry were having a very difficult time. But it became quite overwhelming. I couldn't keep giving them all more time. And so I realized I needed to make a change somehow, which was either cutting down to 2 of them and trying to do enough work for those 2. But actually what I ended up doing was a complete change in tack, going from being organizer side to supplier side. So I joined one of the virtual event platforms. I saw, so it was Glisser. I think it's all right to say that. Glisser is a really interesting story in itself.
Absolutely. And let's call names. Unfortunately, Glisser is no longer in
unfortunately,
business. But,
that was actually very sad moment when I learned about that, but that can come later. So I saw Mike Piddock, who was the founder of Glisser, speak on a webinar, and I thought everything he said I agreed with, and everything he said was the future of events, to be honest. So I sent him a LinkedIn message and asked him if I could have a job. And many conversations later, there was plenty of due diligence and rigor in the process. But I joined Glisser and had an absolutely incredible time with them. I was nearly 2 years, just under, by the time I left. And that experience of seeing such evolution on the event tech side of the sector, such development and growth and expansion, in my opinion, on the whole approach to events across the sector was humbling at times to see. It was frenetic at times to be part of such a fast-growing startup, and it was truly fascinating to see how many different use cases for events the different customers were taking, and to see the different goals and objectives and challenges and frustrations. And I really did find that role was a great privilege to have. I will always think back on it with such fondness, and also the relationships built were just phenomenal, fantastic. So really
Question
great company.
About that moment in time. So the start of the pandemic, or the first few months, the big lockdowns, etc. Were you surprised at how the industry struggled to figure out virtual events? Because I think we were both in positions where we were sort of pretty comfortable with that.
Yeah.
And I was certainly surprised at how I understand, of course, that the venue people and the catering people, there was no business in virtual events, but there were so many kind of content focused people and organization focused people that I felt really were sort of completely lost. And I was so surprised that they couldn't figure out how to do what they did in a virtual context.
Do you know what I think it is, or was fear. So yes, I agree with you. I found it at times a little bit frustrating how afraid people were of making mistakes of the technology actually itself. I think there was a lot of, I'm not a tech person, I don't get it, I can't understand it. And actually a lot of it is, even then, was pretty plug and play. Was it always perfectly intuitive and brilliantly designed? Absolutely, categorically not, because a lot of this stuff was developed at breakneck speed and not how anyone would have done it by any normal process or normal effort. But you're particularly making me remember a conversation I had, and it was about, I think it was about embedding a Zoom key, well, not even embedding, it was inserting a Zoom key into a virtual event platform, so that, it wasn't Glisser, it was before I joined Glisser, so that the attendees would be able to see the live stream, which was just basically Zoom feeding into a virtual event platform. And it was Brella, actually. I remember now, it was Brella. And the team just couldn't get it. They couldn't get that all they had to do was copy and paste a key and just put it into Brella, into the box that said insert stream key here. And this conversation went on for about an hour with this sort of deep-seated fear that they'd done it wrong, because they hadn't done it before. So I wasn't critical of individuals who were struggling with it, and also at the same time was struggling with huge volumes of change at work, also struggling with often incredible pressures at home. But it was surprising, I suppose. It felt very comfortable what to do for me, and it didn't feel scary of how we're actually going to make this event happen. It was all the usual live event moments of sitting on a knife edge, is it all going to go okay? But it did feel like we weren't advanced enough, perhaps as an entire sector, and we'd allowed ourselves to not pay enough attention to the future. But I think a lot of people have recognized that since, and we've been forced to modernize in a time frame that we probably would have been a lot slower if we hadn't been forced to take this approach.
Absolutely. And I agree with you. I don't think there's any point in criticizing people or anything like that. There was obviously a lot of pressure and a lot of fear. It was more from the sense of, I guess, the somewhat sort of distancing of the industry in general from technology that I think continues to be a challenge in some ways, right? Because we sort of had this great test, and then suddenly it was panic stations, and then we figured it out. But I wanted to actually go back to your comment. You said earlier that you were doing these virtual events and they're pretty basic platforms, but you had some tips on how to make people behave the way you
Yeah.
wanted them to, right? Do you remember the kind of broadly what they were? Because I think that's always fascinating. You create these 3D spaces, or you don't, or whatever platform you run on. There's always behaviors like, okay, there's a Q&A, there's a chat, and everybody puts the questions in the chat, and that's frustrating, like those kind of things.
Yeah.
Like, what were people doing, and what were you telling them, or how are you kind of getting them to go in the direction that you wanted them to go?
Yeah. So first thing I would say is, and this definitely still stands, but less is more. So we fell down the same trap that pretty much everybody does when they first start with these platforms, and we switched on every feature we possibly could because I mentioned the team was very experimental and very sort of progressive minded and wanted to test all these cool new features. So let's have 3 meeting rooms on at the same time as the exhibition hall, and let's have 3 live sessions at the same time. It was totally overwhelming for attendees arriving, and the visual impact of particularly VFairs when we were using it then was such a novelty at that point in time that you'd arrive in a virtual exhibition room, for example, or a virtual event lobby, and there were so many things to click on, and that's exactly what people did. They clicked around like random flies flying around a room, and you could see it when you tracked where an individual had been. There was no rhyme nor reason to it. So actually, less is more was the approach we took, which was to really minimize the volume of activity going on simultaneously, and to make it much harder for someone to just click around randomly all over the shop, and to be very, very clear with the notifications, which again, at the time, people mostly had notifications enabled because it was a different era when people were a little bit more open to that, and it was still in the novelty factor. To be much clearer with signposting around the events as well, which I think is something you have to continue to do today with both in-person and online events. Actually, you've just got to tell people what to do. It sounds so simple, but folks like to be told at events, in my opinion. On the whole, there are some events that are exceptions to that rule, and they're very, very heavy networking events. So I'm going to leave that group of events out of this statement. But where you've got content heavy events and you've created a bit of a journey for attendees at that event, just tell them what that journey is, and send them on it, because people don't ever do enough preparation for an event, in my experience, and I'm going to include myself in that sometimes too. It's just so damn hard to find the time.
You write all those emails to tell people what they should be doing, and then nobody reads the emails, and they show up and they're like, what's happening?
Yeah. And I'm much better on the whole at this now, but I was definitely guilty in the past of turning up to an event and then being like, oh right, where's the agenda? And obviously I'd looked at it when I was deciding to go, but then not looking at it again. That's just stupid, but that's not abnormal behavior. It's just how attendees still behave very often.
I would argue that that's the vast majority of people, and so I think it's important that we have things in place to mitigate that and to help them figure that out.
If I know I arrived, as I said, I am genuinely much better at it now, because I just get so frustrated at myself for not making the most of the day if I don't prepare a little bit. But when you haven't prepared and you arrive and someone tells you what to do, you are so happy. Because oh great, thanks for telling me. Now I don't have to spend ages scrolling through my phone or getting out my laptop or trying to find a board with the agenda on it. So
I'm always appreciative of apps that allow you to see the agenda when you're offline, like if an event has an app. Because if you're on a flight on the way to the event, you're likely thinking about that event. And if you can scroll through an agenda and kind of, even if it's not up to date with the latest information, if you can get a pretty good agenda there, that's the place where I'm really thinking about the event, right? That's the time when I think it really sinks in.
Yes, especially on a plane when you can't do a lot else.
Exactly. I'm not a fan of Wi-Fi on planes, so I do like the offline modes whenever I can. But let's get back. I know we haven't come to the present day, so I want to make sure to kind of bring you your present day as well. So Glisser, that ended as well, and then you stayed within the tech side, right?
Yeah, I did. I started working for a company called Notified, really interesting business that has both event technology, webinars, virtual events predominantly, and also a very strong arm in investor relations and press relations. I was going to say that, which isn't quite the right phrase, but a really strong press release feature set as well. PR, that's the right phrase. Public relations. There we go. Sorry, got there in the end.
We'll get there.
And it was my main reason for wanting to go there was to experience tech outside the event tech world, which is exactly what I got there. It was a really, really impactful way to learn about different tech lines and how it was a huge business as well. It's certainly in the event tech land, huge business. So it was great to see the different approach that you'd take in a large business compared to a smaller business. So it was a really good addition to my, I would say my overall event tech and event landscape understanding.
And this was so Notified made 2 acquisitions, I believe, right? They acquired Hub, I think in 2017 or 18.
Maybe even, I think it might have been a bit later than that. Even 2020 even. I'm sorry, I actually don't. It was before I joined, but it was certainly reasonably recent. Yeah. So I had the great chance to work with the brilliant Ali Magar, who set up Hub. Absolutely awesome person to work with. Really enjoyed my time with her.
But they also had another acquisition, right? Did they?
I'm picking my brains now, and I feel like this is something I should know. But it's not
in Expo? Was in Expo not part of
right.
that?
Sorry, you're right. So, great point. You have to go back in time a little bit on this.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm just because I'm thinking, the Notified platform essentially comes from those 2 acquisitions, if I'm not mistaken. I don't want any kind of state secrets.
You are correct. You are correct. That was further before. So Notified was formerly known as Intrado, which might be more familiar actually to some listeners. And in Expo, yes, I believe you're correct, was acquired by Intrado quite a while ago. I think that one might have been more of the time frame that you were thinking actually, and Hub was more recent.
Hub was actually 2021. I'm just reading now. So it was definitely active.
So yes, you're absolutely correct. Sorry, I was thinking in more recent times. And so yes, in Expo was the, I guess, original platform. And even actually before then, they had a separate webinar platform as well. So it's actually the amalgamation of lots of incredibly long-standing tech products.
And that must have its challenges as well, right? Because you have these different products that you're kind of bringing into one umbrella brand, and you're trying to kind of get clients to use whichever.
Absolutely. And the thing that Notified absolutely blew me away with is the service. I mean, incredible levels of service provided to their clients. And that was something that was so often criticized during the pandemic, was the lack of service that some providers were able to offer or wanted to offer, actually, I think in some instances where they were trying to go down a really self-service route. And Notified really, really embraced the service in a completely impressive and faultless way, actually. So that was a great exposure piece for me as well.
Let me check something with you on that. I was speaking to Tim Groot from Grip, who I believe you know, and he had a comment that I've been meaning to really expand on, which was, if the tech is equal, if the solutions offered between 2 solutions is relatively equal, service level will always be the decision. Like that will be what the decider of how people buy software. And I think that's something that it is becoming more and more obvious, but it's an interesting factor because, I mean, to me, it speaks to the fact that events are so time critical, and you need to feel really confident that the technology is going to work. And you're only going to feel that if you know that the service is going to be there, right? That the support is going to be there. But like you say, I think that whole SaaS model, I think a lot of the tech companies have this dream of everything being self-service, and then that's not what event managers want.
So I've said this several times to often within businesses I've been working in, and I'm going to stand by it for now. On the whole, the event sector, let me change that, sorry, virtual event platforms will struggle with a fully SaaS model, because the nature of events doesn't fit into a fully SaaS model, in that events are not repeatable in exactly the same fashion. They are rarely as frequent as most SaaS platforms would be used. Let's just take Salesforce, because everyone's familiar with it. A user of Salesforce will be going in there, but will be living in there probably on a daily basis, multiple logins per day, cannot do their work without using it pretty much every day. Totally different to a virtual event platform, where you may only need it twice a year. You may need it 5 times a month, sure, but you may not need it that frequently. And so you are never going to be retaining and engaging the users in the same way as you would on a sort of slightly more typical SaaS approach. Now, there are certain event tech solutions that are a little bit better suited to being completely self-service, plug and play, really, really nice and simple, and that's awesome. But the nature of events and the sort of, I was going to say seasonality, but I don't mean quite literally by the seasons. I mean the infrequency of use, quite possibly, that would be associated with events, make it very, very hard for a full SaaS model. There are other reasons beyond that as well, but it's the principle that is good on paper. In practice, difficult, really difficult.
Yeah. I think it's that high stakes and time specific nature of events, right? When you have so many people logging in at one time, whether if it's in person or virtual, but technology just has to work. And
I think if you imagine a really, really crucial internal communication event, where, so if I think of one in the past, I'm not going to name the company, but Big Four is probably okay. Every single employee across their globe was invited to the event. It ran over a 24-hour window. And at one point, the CEO addressed the audience. That moment in time, I've actually got goosebumps thinking about it. The pressure associated with that from a delivery perspective is insane. And even if, in my opinion, that CEO was going to log into someone's Salesforce instance, to go back to the Salesforce comparison, I think it's quite likely that somebody would have contacted Salesforce to say, by the way, our CEO is going to log in and check this out. Can we just make sure everything's perfect? So, and in reality, that never actually happens, but it is such high stakes, as you say, and it's, again, quite hard to fit that into a repeatable SaaS model.
Yeah. There's I don't know if you've been following the kind of Shopify anti-meetings thing that they're doing.
I haven't. I need to know this.
So I was just kind of thinking, because they've just created an internal widget on, I think, Chrome or something like that, that gives people an estimate of how much money a meeting is costing. And this is for internal meetings, right? But it sort of says, hey, if you're having a half an hour meeting with people at these levels, that meeting is going to be, like $2,000 worth of.
But it's horrifying,
time, right? And if you think about that for an event, right, it would be millions, right? If you think about the high stakes of bringing it all together.
Massive.
And when you put it in those terms, it almost kind of dwarfs the cost of any event and the kind of any extra cost that you need to invest in support. You're like, we'll set that up, right?
Well, and actually that leads on to something which I feel very, very passionately about in the B2B event sector at the moment, is that you have to make events worth people's time, because it's not just the cost, maybe they've got to fly somewhere, but it's the unmeasured cost of them not doing their regular work. And I think that's a much bigger priority for folks now when they're attending, or certainly when they're reviewing their experience of an event, is, was it actually worth my time? I think we're way more discerning with our time now, especially if travel is involved. I still think people are very selective about what travel they are and aren't willing to do at this point in time. And sure, that may continue to soften, because I think that's even softened over the last 12 months. But is it actually worth their time as well as the cost? Huge question that has to be asked way more now than it had to be asked 5 years ago.
Yep, I agree with you there. I think I am in a very comfortable position that I get invited to speak at a lot of events and do a lot of events. And a lot of times I feel from the organizers that there's just this expectation that I'll jump on the plane because it's covered. Like they're going to cover my costs and put me up in a nice hotel, and I'll just be like delighted to jump on a plane and go do that. And I have to admit that I'm not, right. Like it has to make sense for the business. It has to make sense for me. It has to take a lot of boxes. And I'm always amazed that people sort of feel quite shocked that I'm kind of saying no a lot of times. So I feel like as an industry we're a bit spoiled in that sense.
You have to be selective, and that's a good thing in my opinion. But I'd also think we are going to see an increasing preference for, I really detest this word, but it works, but bleisure travel. So business and leisure, and blending them together when you can. I had a conversation about this just yesterday even. I did this myself at the beginning of the year. I was invited to speak at an event in Saudi Arabia. They very kindly covered my expenses, but I only went because I took a couple of days of holiday and I extended it, and I actually experienced somewhere I would never previously have been before. If I could only have done the event and come back the next day, I probably wouldn't have done it, to be honest. It's firstly a reasonably long way to go for a short trip, but I don't know if I'd have been able to justify the time, but because I could add a personal experience into it as well, it was one of the best trips I've done, well, quite literally in years, thanks to COVID. But it was an absolutely fantastic experience. And I think the concept of bleisure, as I said, not my favorite word, but it works, is on the rise, and it's going to affect B2B events going forwards.
Let me dig a little bit deeper on that one, because I definitely see this as a trend. I see events also investing in this as a trend. So perhaps selecting destinations that are more leisure, kind of focused or more attractive in some ways. Do you think there's a danger that the industry kind of goes back in time and becomes just a jolly good ride to nice destinations?
Boondoggles. I remember being told about those when I used to run events in the States years ago.
But actually, it's a serious question, right? Because I think there's this sort of, bleisure seems like a sort of code word for it's okay, it's business and pleasure. But are we then just having parties and people going to events that are nice parties?
That's not what I see. It is, I think there's a risk for sure. And it's a risk that should always be considered, that you don't get the balance wrong. But actually, exactly what I was saying earlier, people are still incredibly discerning with their time, and I don't believe that people are going to waste their time going to the business portion of a trip that is a waste of their time. I just don't think people will justify it. There is still going to be the need to justify your reasons for going to business activities, and I also think looking forwards, and this potentially opens a huge can of worms, but in the not too distant future, there's going to be the carbon measurement of attending these sorts of activities as well. So no, I think I'm going to say no. Is it a risk? Yes. Do I think it will happen? I believe in us. I'm going to say no.
More to come on that. I think that there's definitely a trend there that's worth exploring, and I just feel like the industry spent a long time justifying the ROI of events, and I think if they do become boondoggles, there's a danger that things are cut and
could undermine themselves.
We just heard this morning about the Commonwealth Games being cancelled. Bit of a different reason for that, and it's not directly related. But I think there's an element of the politics around investing a huge amount of money in a public event like that, and a state kind of saying, no thanks, we said we'd do it, but actually it's way more expensive than we thought it was going to be, and we'd rather invest in hospitals and schools. It's hard to argue against that.
It's incredibly hard. I don't think you can argue against the reasoning. You might be frustrated by the perhaps forecasting and planning that went into estimating the costs that were, by all accounts, what we're hearing at the moment, so far out from what they've actually turning out to look like they're going to be. But
which is not unusual, unfortunately, right? We all hear stories of Olympic Games and other massive events that go twice, 3 times over budget and things like that. And
this
sort of gets, just something that happens, and there's nothing
event
you can
budgeting,
do about it.
Hey, that's a whole topic.
I mean, twice or 3 times is a bit exaggerated for any kind of corporate event that I know, but
yes, that's true. I think you're right to flag it though, because it could be easy to get carried away with the fun stuff. And actually, I also feel that B2B events need as much of the experience-based experience that happens at an event. I can't quite conjure up the word. Activities, engagements, the things that connect with people. And I do think that is driven by the B2C event world.
Mm-hmm.
People have an expectation of feeling some sort of an emotional connection with an event, in my experience these days. And I think that's a great thing. And I don't think we should say, oh, it's a B2B event, therefore it doesn't need to emotionally connect with people. And we don't want people to go home feeling personally satisfied, as well as satisfied from a business perspective. And getting that balance is going to be challenging, and it should definitely be addressed. So I think you're absolutely right to raise it. I'd like to believe that in the next couple of years, we can at least make a good inroad into getting this balance right.
Yep, absolutely. I like the idea of having balance. So we haven't actually come to what you're doing right now. So I'd love to make sure we cover that, and also just talk a little bit about your work with women in leadership, because I think you're one of the few women in event tech, or has been working in event tech, and I think it would be interesting to talk about that. But tell me what you're doing now, and let's jump into that afterwards.
Yes, for sure. So I'm now doing quite a lot of independent work, so consulting and contracting in the event space predominantly, some also in the sort of, I would say, slightly wider media space. So I'm doing some work at the moment with an event tech company, awesome gamification tools, help them develop their partnerships program. I'm doing some work quite randomly with a drinks company. So that falls outside the tech work, but some advisory work there. Also working with an event tech marketplace, which has been really interesting to see that grow and develop. And most of my time for the rest of this year is with an event organizer again. So back on the delivery side, the organizer side, with a very large publishing house, which is been a real privilege to be involved in and part of that, actually, and to help them develop their event strategy, both digital. All of their events are hybrid, actually, digital and in person, and also their video on demand strategy as well. So quite a lot of different activities, different organizations, and it's been brilliant to see organizer side again after a few years, and to see the real organizer mentality to event tech. Having been on the other side has been fascinating, actually. Some massive tech products and some quite smaller tech products, many being considered as well, which is, so I'm very lucky to be still involved in event tech in lots of different ways.
Mm-hmm. And feel free to name names. I know you avoided that, but you're very welcome.
I don't know if I'm allowed to, and I don't suddenly feel like I haven't asked their permission, so I don't want to go and blab it on a podcast. But I'm sure they'd be okay with it if I'd asked in advance. I should have asked in advance.
So tell me about your work with women in leadership, because I think that's an issue that we come to often with our guests, and I think it's always good to highlight any positive initiatives there.
Well, where to begin? We've seen massive progress, firstly, and I think it's really important to acknowledge when it happens. I've always been fortunate that I've never felt that I've been, I would say, held back by being a woman in business. There are definitely moments when I go, oh, not many other people here in this room who I would automatically assume would identify as being women, but I do think we've made great progress, and there's a lot more that we can continue to do. I think just to raise the profile of women and female leadership in this sector, and not just the tech side, actually. I think it's important to address it across all elements of the event sector. One thing that really stands out to me, which tells me we still need to do more on this, and I wish I could remember the exact numbers, and I apologize that I can't, but there was a very interesting survey result released, was probably the beginning of this year, and it talked about different seniority levels throughout the entire event sector. I would say it's probably more organizer side than supplier side, if there was a trend in there. And what was very clear is that at the lower levels and the mid levels, it's the sector is still very female dominated. But actually there's more higher, the higher up you go, the lower that number drops, and the more likely you are to see that companies have male leadership at the top. And that to me does say we're still not getting something quite right with retaining women in this space. Well, this is reflected in many companies, industries, not just the event sector. So we have got a lot more to do. And I think a lot of this comes around enabling all of the workforce to have flexibility, all of the workforce to have good access to parental leave, which I know in theory in the UK at least, which is where I'm based, in theory, parental leave is much better now, or at least what's available. It doesn't mean people necessarily take it yet because they don't necessarily feel that they can take it. But I think there's progress, and we've just got to keep pushing it and keep enabling both male and female leaders to enable each other. Actually, I don't think it is one-sided. I don't think it's just about women making a change. I don't think it's just about men making a change. I think it's a really collaborative effort. It's amazing to see organizations like Women in Exhibitions thriving, and that organization is thriving. It's fantastic to see, and I'm sure it will continue to thrive, and there's some wonderful male advocates that are part of that too. So progress, we need more. I think if I was to say one thing that would maybe be my call to arms, it is, gentlemen, we need you to keep pushing this for us. It is not a female problem. It is not a male problem. This is a combined effort, and you are 100% welcome at the table. And I say that because it was last year's International Women's Day, and I asked a very experienced, he's a fellow consultant in the space, it's International Women's Day, are you going to do anything? And he was like, am I allowed to? I said, well, you've got a wife and 2 daughters, so I'm going to go with yes, you're allowed to say something, do something to promote International Women's Day. And that's a throwaway example, but it did make me realize that if he didn't feel that he was allowed to, that he was unlikely to be the only gentleman in that position. So yeah, we still need you. Please be vocal. Please, if you think you can be doing more, you can be doing more, and collectively I think we can all make some more progress.
I think that's excellent points. I just wanted to highlight that I think Freeman came out with a survey, or they came out with some data about the next generation of event goers, and I thought that was interesting. But I picked out a data point that they had in there, which was, I believe, 82% of event attendees across Freeman's shows, and as we know, Freeman does thousands and thousands of shows, are male. And although that's slightly changing, so the newer generations are slightly more female, there's still something like 70% male. Wow. Which is not something we talk about a lot. We talk about the male-female balance in the sector and the leadership thing, which is absolutely, right to be talked about. But we also don't talk about that in general. It's women organizing events for men to attend. And I think that's an even bigger sort of signal that as a whole society, we're not quite there yet.
We're not quite there yet. We are definitely not quite yet there. We're nowhere near there, actually, if I'm really blunt. But it's only by having these metrics, so thank you, Freeman, for taking the time to report those. It's only by having this in black and white that we can actually say this is something we need to address. Otherwise, it's speculative. So we've got to start from somewhere, and just even getting those baseline stats is a phenomenal start, frankly. So we can all do more. Baby steps. Absolutely. They all make a massive difference.
Vanessa, great to have you on the podcast. We could talk for a few more hours, but I want to wrap up, make sure we'll keep everybody honest on their time, etc.
For sure.
But I wanted to get your recommendation for someone else to have on the podcast.
Yes, my recommendation is an amazing individual called Nick Bennett. And Nick is all about the creator economy, the power of people first go to market. So not product first, but actually getting people to promote what you do on your behalf. So he would say, I would say the influencer economy. He probably wouldn't use the word influencer because he's much more eloquent on these matters than I am. He's writing a book on this at the moment. He is absolutely brilliant with his content, and I think he could be a great person to help the event sector learn.
Excellent. We appreciate your recommendation, and we will connect with Nick and then try to make it happen.
Awesome.
Thanks again. It's been an absolute pleasure. Really
thanks for
enjoyed
having
the
me.
conversation. Hope everybody listening also enjoyed the conversation, and see you again soon.
Thank you.